The series we're doing on Wednesday nights is Old Testament Cameos, and we are looking at a lot of characters who there's just not much said about. Some of these guys, there's only one verse or one chapter. But then right in the middle, you've got me and Jason Rucker. Jason did Job, which has an entire book, and I'll be talking about Joseph tonight, who has a dozen or so chapters to him. So I don't know why these two guys are in a book about cameos when they are main characters with a lot to say. You think we'll be able to get through all of it tonight? I highly doubt it. But we will get as far as we can, and we'll make applications as we go along the way. If you'll open up in Genesis chapter 37, that's where we'll start eventually. Actually, there are 5 times that Joseph is mentioned before his story really starts in Genesis chapter 37. And so it's interesting, a couple of the things that happen there. I want to mention that to you. I don't have a handout and don't have a PowerPoint. One thing I've started doing lately is trying to take my Bible and really add notes to it as I sit through a lesson. Maybe link up something in the Old Testament to the New Testament, or I remember, I think it was Johnny Drake, the lesson that he was doing about the man that betrayed David. And I had known that story, but I did not realize that that was Bathsheba's grandfather, I think it was. So no wonder there were hard feelings with that. Well, you put that note in your Bible, and that makes the story make more sense forever. So I've been trying to do that, and that'll be something good you can do tonight, because we'll just be going through chapter by chapter here in just a minute. But in Genesis, before Genesis 37, Joseph's mentioned by name 5 times, but really his story starts back even further than that. There is a theme that happens in Genesis that's going to carry all the way through to Joseph, all the way through to God's people in the Promised Land, all the way through to God's people as they're exiles out of the land of Canaan, and really even carries on to you and I today. And it starts in Genesis, even in the garden. You remember Adam and Eve, they sin and they are kicked out of or exiled out of the garden, and they're not allowed to stay there. And that theme carries itself through, like I said. You get to Abraham, and what happens to him when God comes to him? He says, get out of this land and go to another one. And I kind of can see Abraham saying, well, where do you want me to go? And God, it's like he says, well, I'll tell you when you get there. Okay? And so Abraham is a man of faith, and he gets up and he leaves, but he's in exile. He lives a very nomadic life. Because of the problems that Jacob and Esau have as they clash, Jacob runs scared for his life, and he lives most of his life as an exile. And so when we get to Joseph, he is just carrying on a theme that God's people have always carried on, and that is this theme of exile. Being exiled and kicked out from the land that you grew up in, or your homeland. And really that carries through to us today. We are, most of us, Americans, and we love the country that we're in. But that is not our primary citizenship. As much as I may love the country, it's not the kingdom that I love the most, because I'm in a far better kingdom, one that stretches all the way back through time and will last eternally. And nothing that I love will compare to how much I love the primary country and kingdom of my residence, the church. And that's an important message for us. Though we're in this world, we're not of it. We're just pilgrims passing through, and in a large way, we are exiles even in America today from our main country that we are in. All right, and then number 2, something you see from Joseph's life before we get to where it really starts in chapter 37. I'm going to read a couple of verses for you so that you don't have to flip back and forth. And I'll try to read these slow so that you can get what we're saying. But the second thing that I want us to see, the first thing, the lesson number 1 really is we are exiles even today, looking for a better land, a better country. But number 2, lesson number 2 is that sometimes our family problems follow us. Sometimes our family problems follow us. And I want you to see this in the life of Joseph early on before he's even born. Back in chapter 25 and verse 28, we see that Isaac, his grandfather, had a favorite son, and Rebekah, his grandmother, had a favorite son. And those sons were different. 25:28 says, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. What kind of problems do you think pop up in a family when there's a favorite? Could you see anything that could go wrong with that? I had one of something recently, and my kids wanted it, and I said, I'm going to give it to my favorite. And they all 3 said, yay, because they thought they were all 3 my favorite, and they are. And that's how it should be. That would not have been the case in Isaac and Rebekah's house, because they knew who was whose favorite. You keep going through their story, and in Genesis 29, verse 30, Jacob keeps that same family sin, that same problem, at the forefront of his life. In Genesis 29:30 it says, So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved her more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. So Isaac and Rebekah have favorite sons. Jacob has a favorite wife, and he is eventually going to have favorite children. We get to 37, verse 3, so that's where we'll pick up, Genesis 37:3. It says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe or a coat of many colors, or that was special." So you see this problem, it's a family problem. And we do that today. If your family has a certain problem, a lot of times that goes on generation to generation. And someone has to stand up and say, I'm going to break this family curse. I know that's where I came from, and I know that's what everybody before me has struggled with, but to the best of my ability, I'm going to break this. Whether it's physical health problems, whether it's financial, or whether it's spiritual, like it was here. Eventually, someone had to stand up and say, we're going to break this problem of favoritism in the family, because it cost them all dearly. You back up again, skipping back out of Genesis 37, in chapter 33, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he himself went on before, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother." So let me ask you this. Why was Jacob, he is afraid of Esau in this situation. And when he sees him for the first time in a long time, he bows down to the ground to him to show humility and to show reverence. Why is Jacob afraid of Esau? Say that again. Okay. All right. Jacob was a trickster, a prankster. He messed with Esau and cost him dearly. And when he did that, he left town. He created a problem and then ran away so that he wouldn't be killed. And that was smart, because Esau was hot when it happened and probably would have killed him. And now after all this time, Jacob hasn't seen Esau, and he has no idea how he's going to react. Is he still going to have that anger? Will he have mellowed? I don't know what's going to happen. But look at the order in which Jacob puts his family. All right? As they're going out to meet Esau, he goes to the front. But do you see who he puts after that? Who does he put after himself at the front of the line? You'll have to be loud. Okay, so initially he puts the 2 female servants and their kids. All right, and then after that, he puts his second favorite wife, which is messed up in and of itself, Leah, and her children. And then who is last in order to maybe keep them safe? So, look, we're going to put all this family out front, and if something bad goes down, we'll put our favorite family in the back, and they can get away. And so Rachel and Joseph are put in the back of the line. Now, do you think the wives noticed that? Do you think the kids noticed that? How often do kids ask questions? Only when they're awake, I think. And the entirety of the time that they're awake. Kids ask questions. Do you think that maybe Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, do you think any of them ask, hey, why did Dad put us up front when he is very clearly scared of this guy that we're going to meet? Do you think Joseph noticed maybe that they were in the back and said, hey, why can't we go to the front with everyone else? Do you think maybe they asked their parents those questions? All right. So now let's move into the full story of Joseph's life. Look at chapter 37, and we'll just march through as much time as we have. All right, look at verse 1. Somebody tell me where they are right now. So Jacob and his family, including Joseph, where are they? Where's that? All right, the land of Canaan. Does that strike anyone as interesting? Because God has promised the land of Canaan to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to Joseph. And, well, here they are in the land of Canaan. But it's not theirs yet. They're there, but they don't own it yet. God has not given it to them yet. Now look at verse 2. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, those 2 servants' wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Do kids ever tell on their siblings? Man, mine do that a lot. Maybe it's just my little angels that do that. But I think all kids do that. They tell on their siblings. But something complicated this relationship even more than your typical sibling relationship, because these were all from different wives. And so there was a whole political and emotional thing at play here. And some of these kids had mothers who Jacob did not love as much as another one. And so that, of course, caused a lot of drama and a lot of problems. So let's think about this. Lesson number 3. There are always going to be problems when we stray from God's ideal of marriage. I'm going to pause for just a second and talk about this, and we'll come back to Genesis. But look at Matthew chapter 19 for just a minute. And I want to see a couple things that this story of Joseph, this story of Jacob and all the wives and all the drama that comes with that really has to have us pause and think about for just a minute. But in Matthew chapter 19, if you look at verse 3, it says, "The Pharisees came to Jesus and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?'" So that's a good question, but notice that they don't have good hearts in asking Jesus this. They are trying to test him. Because if he says one answer, they can say, "Aha, we got you, and you're too legalistic." Or if he says another answer, they can say, "Aha, you don't care about the letter of the law and the law of Moses." And so they're really trying to put him in a predicament. Now, they don't like Jesus' answer, so look down at verse 7. They bring up Moses looking for exceptions. Yeah, what you just said, Jesus. But didn't Moses say we can give a writing of divorcement for any reason? But Jesus told them, he said, "You're going back to Moses, but you're not going back far enough. Go back to the garden." So look at verse 8. He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Now that mirrors what he has just said in verses 4 through 6. Jesus says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.'" Verse 6, "So they're no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." So God's ideal for marriage has always been one man, one woman for life, with that one exception that was given. And when we try to do anything else with that, just like Joseph's family saw, just like Jacob's family saw, problems come from that. Think about Abraham. How many of his problems came because he tried to do things his way? Because he went outside of God's ideal for marriage. How many of our problems today still exist because of the war going on between those peoples? Back to Joseph in Genesis chapter 32. Chapter 37, verse 3. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons." And those problems came from those marriage problems as well. All right, now let's read the end of verse 3. It says, "He made him a robe of many colors." All right, so lesson number 4 for us tonight is do your own research. If I were to ask you, where was Jesus born, what would you say to that? Not the city, but the place in the city. Where was Jesus born? You'll have to say it louder. I'll hand you my mic. All right. So a stable. Sometimes we say an inn. It's the idea that he was born in the barn at a hotel. Okay? But if you do your research on that, what you will find is the only reason that anyone believes that is because the King James translation in one verse translated where he stayed as inn, I-N-N. And from that translation, which is, we'll see as we continue to discuss this, really a mistranslation, people since then have always said Jesus was born basically in a barn at a hotel. But when you look at that word, the primary definition in the original language is not hotel or inn. And as a matter of fact, it would have been an insult to everything that the Jews stood for if a pregnant woman coming back to the homeland to be counted in the census ended up having to stay with someone other than family. What is most likely true is she got to a relative's house and they said, we're full. There's too many people here. But we do have some space in the front of the house where we bring the animals in each night. Because you don't want them to run off. You don't want them to be stolen. You don't want them to be attacked by another animal. And so you bring them in right at the front, and then everybody's bedroom is in the back on an elevated place. And most likely, that's where Jesus was born, in the front part of that house. But why do we believe he was born in a hotel's barn? Well, because that's where one verse translated one passage. And nothing else historically backs that up, but we believe it because that's just what we've always been told. All right, what about this? What about the song that we sing sometimes, "Tell Me the Story of Jesus," which is a great song. But there's a line that says, "Angels sang as they welcomed his birth." Now, if you do research on that, the Bible never says that they sang, it says that they proclaimed. Now, could they have sang? Well, yeah, absolutely. But we can't say for a matter of fact that the angels sang when Jesus was born, because there's just no scriptural proof to that. Now, bring that up because you see that exact thing happen here in the case of Joseph and the coat of many colors. The only reason that this is translated as many colors in our language is because when the Greeks got to this Hebrew Old Testament passage and they translated it, they called it a coat of many colors. But there is really no linguistic or historical proof that that's what the Hebrew word meant. As a matter of fact, it typically means a robe with long sleeves, or that's long to the ground, or that is embroidered in a certain way. And so we see it in pictures, we teach it in kids' classes, Joseph had a coat of many colors. Well, not necessarily. Most likely he just had a very nice coat that would have definitely made him special, that would have stood out, but it may or may not have had anything to do with the color of it. Now, I point this out because I don't think any of these things matter that much. They definitely, I don't think, are going to put any of our salvation in jeopardy if we continue to think Joseph had a coat that was very colorful. But my point in this is to say, if we can be wrong about some of these things that we have just assumed are right for our entire life, how many other things could we be wrong about? I know I have taught Jesus was born in a barn at a hotel, and I've taught that Joseph had a very colorful coat my entire life. And I think that's okay. I was just mistaken. But we have to be careful, because if we're mistaken about certain things, there are some big implications to that. And the best thing we can do is do our own research. And that's going to be very important. All right, now look at verse 5. So we're still in Genesis 37. It says, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more." So I'm going to give you a summary of the dream. Some sheaves were out in the field, and Joseph's sheaf stood up, his bundle of grain, if you want to think about it that way. And the bundles of his brothers bowed down to worship him. And he told his brothers this dream, and how do you think they reacted to that? They loved it. They were excited for Joseph. This is great news. You're going to be powerful. We're going to bow down to you. Congratulations. No, they hated him for it. He has another dream, and he says, this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So even indicating his parents would bow down to him. And he tells his brothers and his dad even is taken aback by that. Do you think that I'm going to worship you and bow down and worship you and that kind of thing? And so they hated him. So lesson number 5 I want you to consider is that pride is our enemy. Michael said this last night in his gospel meeting. I think it was last night or maybe the night before, but pride maybe is our biggest enemy. And it is a part of all of the other things that we deal with. And Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." So pride is our enemy. Now maybe Joseph didn't know what he was doing, telling his brothers. Or maybe he remembered being in the back of the line, being the favorite son of his dad's favorite wife, and having a special coat made for him, and maybe he liked it and did it on purpose. Now look at verses 12 through 13. So we're still in chapter 37, verses 12 through 13. "Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." Now, why wasn't Joseph working with his brothers? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, he's 17 at least, maybe 18 at this time. That's old enough to work. We make our kids work, and they're only 7. So why isn't Joseph working? Well, maybe it has to do with that special coat. Sometimes people were put in special clothes, and it was like, hey, you're not fit for manual labor. You're too good for that. You're above that. And so maybe Joseph was left out because of how much his dad loved him. Now, do you think it's a good idea for Jacob to send his favorite son, who is hated by his brothers, off into a foreign area by himself to check on them? I think that was probably a poor parenting move on his part. You know, we may be too careful with our kids sometimes, but I don't think this was a very wise thing for Jacob to have done. Now look at verses 18 through 21. "They saw him afar off," the brothers did, "and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him." Wow, this is serious. "And they said one to another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we'll say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.'" You know, I think that's why 1 John 3:15 says that everyone who hates their brother is a murderer. Anything that we have in our heart doesn't take long to get to our hands. Something that's in our mind eventually shows itself through our actions. And so, a lesson maybe number 6 for us is if our heart isn't right, then our actions won't be either. And they let their hate, their bitterness for their brother, get them to the point where they were willing to kill him. And it may not be that drastic in our life, but anytime we've got a heart problem, an issue of the heart, it's always going to show itself in our actions. All right, then verses 21 through 24, we'll summarize those. Reuben heard it. He said, he rescued him out of their hands and saying, let's don't take his life. Let's throw him in a pit and just kind of keep him safe. And then it has this note that Reuben had planned to come back later and rescue him. And so verse 23, when Joseph came to his brothers, they took off his robe. It says robe of many colors, but as we noted, this elegant, this special robe, not necessarily colorful, that he wore. And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. And then verses 25 through 28, look at this. They sat down to eat. I have never thrown a person in a pit, nor have I been thrown into a pit. But I have to imagine if I was, I wouldn't be quiet about it. Can you imagine being thrown in a pit by your brothers and just keeping your cool? I imagine not. You probably scream, hoping that someone passes by so that they'll rescue you. Well, you notice what his brothers did by the pit? They sat down and had a picnic. Can you imagine the hate in your heart that you have to be able to sit by a pit where your younger brother is no doubt screaming his head off and just enjoy a meal together? But it's what looks like what they did. And they look up and they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Verse 26, and then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let our hand not be on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. Well, how sweet of them. Man, they really love their brother. What good brothers, right? Verse 28, then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then verses 29 through 36, Reuben returns to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, where shall I go? How can I go home knowing that my dad's favorite son has been killed? Look what they do in verse 31. They took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. Good thing they didn't have like forensics back then. Verse 32, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Oh, please tell us whether it's your son's robe or not. You see that? Liars. They know whose robe it is, and they know what's happened to their brother. In verse 33, just to their shock and awe, he identified it and said, it's my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. And then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. Verse 35. Look at this. All his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him. What a bunch of hypocrites. Oh, Dad, it's okay. Maybe he's fine. They know all the time what happened and that they are the cause of it. But he refused to be comforted and said, no, I'll go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. And meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. All right, now look at chapter 38. Will someone read verse 1? Now you'll have to read it loud, and we're all friends here. So chapter 38, verse 1. All right, so who does chapter 38 start out talking about? Judah. Now, does that seem interesting? We are in the middle of the story of Joseph, one of the most famous people in the Bible. And we're going to take seemingly a detour away from Joseph to talk about one of his brothers for an entire chapter, Judah. Anybody have a guess as to why we spend a chapter? What's so important about Judah? Say it again. The lineage of Christ. You ever been watching a TV show and something's going on with a character and they pause and they go on and they tell you about something else that's going on with a different character, and seemingly the two things are unrelated. But little do you know that later on it's going to be very important what happened with this minor character in the story of the bigger character and in the story of the bigger picture. That's what happens in Genesis chapter 38. Jesus does not come through the lineage, through the seed of Joseph. And as important as Joseph is, what's much more important is the bigger picture of Jesus. And so here we take an entire chapter in the story of this Savior of the Israelites, Joseph, to talk about the real Savior of the Israelites, our Savior, where Jesus is going to come from the line of Judah. Now, most of you will probably know in Old Testament history, the oldest was the one that got the blessings and got the promise. So certain things would happen to mess that up, but that was the typical standard. Whoever was born first got everything. Well, was Judah the firstborn? No. Reuben, Simeon, Levi. So we're all the way to Judah. Why is it that Judah is the one that Jesus comes through? And we won't have time to completely develop this, but if you want to take some notes and look at this later, you can. In Genesis 49, so Genesis 49, 3 through 4, we're going to find out that Reuben has disqualified himself. He's done something of a sexual nature, and he's brought shame upon the family, and part of that is he's going to be skipped for being the child of promise. So Reuben's out. Now we're up to Simeon. If you want to take a note, in Genesis chapter 34, Simeon and Levi are going to disqualify themselves. Now this is a messed up story. Someone sees Dinah, their sister, and wants to sleep with her, and does, and defiles her. And is so in love with her, goes to Jacob and the family and says, hey, we want to marry her. And they hear about what has been done to their sister, and they say, okay. Well, but we can't let her marry anybody that's an uncircumcised heathen. So all of your men have to get circumcised. And when you do, we'll be in a relationship, and we'll be able to take your daughters, you'll be able to take our daughters, we'll intermarry, and we'll be a covenant people together. And the men say, man, these guys are pretty rich. Of course, I want to marry Dinah. This seems like a pretty good situation. Great, we'll agree to your terms. And so all the men of the area are circumcised. But what Simeon and Levi do is they wait until the third day, when the men are at their most sore, and they bring in an army, and they attack them, and they kill them. It's crazy that story is even in the Bible because of how just graphic it is, and really kind of how crazy it is. But that's what happens. But who does vengeance belong to? The Lord. Now, we're told the government is in place for a particular reason, to punish the wrongdoer, and we shouldn't have any fear of the government as long as we obey the laws and those kinds of things. But vengeance ultimately lies with the Lord. It is not up to us to take everything into our own hand, graphic as it may be. And I realize that's easier to say than to do. But Romans 12:19, vengeance belongs to the Lord. And so Reuben, Simeon, and Levi disqualify themselves, and Judah is the seed of promise. All right, look at chapter 39. Verses 1 through 6, Joseph is sold to a ruler named Potiphar. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. All right, lesson number 7. Any success that you ever have will be because God is with you. In James chapter 1 and verse 17, we're told that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. It's from God. Any good idea you ever have, any success you have, any accomplishment that you ever have, it's only because God has given you those talents, those skills, and those opportunities. And it does us well, like Joseph, to remember that God is the source of all the good things in our life, even the good things that we do. All right, now look at verse 7. So we're in chapter 39, marching along. Verse 7, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. Now, do you think Potiphar's wife was pretty? I mean, Potiphar was probably one of the best-to-do kind of guys in the land. I don't foresee him having a wife that was unattractive. Do you think Joseph was lonely? Boy, I bet he was. I bet he was lonely. We work on doing what's right, even when it's not easy. And not just when people are looking, but always. We do what's right, not just when it's easy, and not just when people are looking, but always. You know, the Pharisees got that backwards, right? We want to look good on the outside. Who cares about the inside? For us, we would rather people see us on the outside and think we're a mess than to have something wrong on the inside. Because we want to do what's right, no matter if it's hard, no matter who's looking. All right, look at verse 8. He refused and said, how can I do this great and wicked sin against God? You know, all sin is against God. You know, if you and I have a problem, one of us mistreats the other, we also mistreat God in that situation. All sin is against God. Now look at verses 10 and 11. It says that she did this, called to him, said, sleep with me day by day. Just wearing him down, wearing him down. Look at verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. It's really interesting that as you read the Bible, God is constantly telling you to fight against sin. Stand your ground. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Fight sin. You know what one sin the Bible tells you not to stand around and try to fight, but to run from? Sins of a sexual nature. And you know what Joseph did? He ran and got out of there. Some of us might be in a situation where we need to take our phone and chunk it across the room. We might need to take our computer to the dump. We may be in a store at some point when somebody who's not married to us flirts with us, and we might need to run out of the store without our groceries, like that Forrest Gump gif where he's just getting it down the road. But whatever the case is, in those situations, we don't stand and fight, we run. And too many problems have come because people have tried to stand their ground and be strong in a situation and in a sin where God says, just run. Somebody has said before, he lost his coat, but he kept his character. And I think that's true. So verses 16 through 20, and we'll go faster through these last chapters, she frames him, and Potiphar throws him into prison. And I've often wondered, do you think Potiphar actually believed his wife? Like, he knew what kind of guy Joseph was. I think if he actually believed her, he would have had him killed. But that's what Middle Eastern culture said you could do in a situation like that. But he didn't. He threw him into jail. And not only jail, but jail for people who had been in the king's court. So I'm not saying it was great, but it was better than your typical jail would have been. So I wonder if part of Potiphar just didn't even believe his wife. It says he got angry, but you have to wonder. All right, verses 20 through 21. Again, while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. You know, Potiphar put Joseph in jail, but God put him around people in and out of the king's court. This is an important lesson for us because what seems bad to you may actually be the best thing that ever happens to you. And sometimes you have no way of knowing that in the moment. I have a friend named Brent Misseldine. He preaches at the Prattville Church of Christ close to Montgomery. He was on the interstate one day between Montgomery and Birmingham, and cars fly through there like they do most interstates, going 80, that kind of thing. And a guy flew behind a car, didn't see him, and rear-ended him going 70-something. And had a huge wreck. The two guys get out of their car, traffic stopped behind him, and a young guy comes up to my friend Brent, crying and scared to death, scared the guy's going to sue him, and Brent just gave him a hug and said, "I'm okay, you're okay. Who cares about the cars? We can get new cars, but we can't replace you. What I want to know is if we had died in this car wreck, are you okay? Would you go to heaven?" Man, I wouldn't do that. So I want to be more like Brent. But you know what happened from that? And this isn't going to happen every time. But that young man just broke down in tears, and he and Brent studied the Bible, and he has since become a Christian. What seemed like the worst thing that could ever happen in this guy's life actually became the best thing that ever happened. And the thing for us to remember as Christians is you just don't know when you're in the middle of something that seems like more than you can handle, like the world's about to end. You don't know, but this could be the best thing that ever happens to you. And even if it's not, God's there with you every step of the way. We'll get to a last lesson to kind of tie that up here in just a minute. What time do we get out? It's 7:40. 7:45? Okay. Yes. All right. Chapter 40. So we'll skip ahead a little bit. Chapter 40. Joseph gets to know the prisoners. He learns about the king and the kingdom, and he interprets dreams, and they come true. Can you imagine a better place to get educated about the king and the kingdom than being continually surrounded by people that used to work with him and for him and in his kingdom? He's in prison, but God has put him there for a reason. Verse 23. Joseph interprets some dreams, and the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Hey, when you get out of prison, remember that I interpret the dreams. Tell Pharaoh about me and get me out of here. And look at chapter 41. Look at verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. 2 years. The guy never thought of Joseph one time to try to get him out of prison. Now, Pharaoh goes on to say, "Hey, I'm having some dreams. Who can help me?" And the cupbearer says, "Oh, I've made a huge mistake. I was supposed to tell you about this guy, Joseph, 2 years ago." Verses 15 through 16, Pharaoh and Joseph are talking, and he says, I've had a dream nobody can interpret. I've heard it said that you can interpret dreams. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It's not me, but God." It's a good lesson for us. Give God the credit for all of the things that you're able to accomplish. He interprets the dream. There's going to be 7 good years. It's going to be like a party. Everything's going well. Crops are growing great. We're all doing good. Finances are up. But it's going to be followed by 7 lean years, and things are going to be terrible and dire. Verse 33, Joseph says, now let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Isn't that what we want to be? It'd be cool if somebody called me discerning and wise, instead of some of the stuff I get called. But discerning and wise, that's what we all want to be. Joseph says, pick out a man like that and set him out over the land of Egypt. Verses 37 through 41, Pharaoh says, great idea. His people say, where can we find a guy like this? Joseph. Joseph is this man. And Joseph is now put in charge, second to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, you're over everything in my kingdom except me. Anything else, what you say goes. Now look at verse 46. This is powerful. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Do you remember how old he was when this whole drama started? 17. He has been in the pit, in Potiphar's house, and in prison for 12 to 13 years. Sometimes our story is rough, and it is a long time in the making. But God is patient. Are we patient? All right, and then Joseph stored up grain during the good years and sold it back to them in the lean years. Chapters 42 through 44, his brothers go to Egypt because there's been a famine in the land of Canaan as well. Joseph comes up with a plan to get his brothers to bring the whole family back. Chapter 43, verse 30. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew. He sees his brothers. He knows who they are. They don't recognize him. His compassion grew warm for his brothers. He sought a place to weep. Chapter 45, verses 1 and 2 says that he can't control himself, and he goes to another room, and he's crying so loud the Egyptians hear him. So two places, Joseph's reaction is to break down in tears. I think a good note for this is that you may have to be in a situation where you're on your own. You're the only spiritual person around you, but it is not healthy for you to stay that way for too long. If you have to be on your own for a while and do what's right no matter what, yes, God expects that, but don't be that way for too long, because it's not healthy. You won't be a healthy and whole person. And I don't think Joseph was either. All right, Joseph chapter 46 brings his family to Egypt. Now look at chapter 46, verse 1. So Israel took his journey. This is Jacob. Now he's going into the land. But before he goes to Egypt, he took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba. Do you know who's living in Beersheba right now? Rod Selman. And I'm hoping, Lord willing, to go visit him sometime either this year or next year. But it's so cool to see that he's living in a place that we can read about in the Bible. Just amazing. All right, now God speaks visions to them. Joseph prepares his chariots. Joseph says, now that I see my son, I'm so happy I can die. He settles in the land of Egypt, and they're multiplied greatly. Chapter 50, Jacob dies. We got maybe 1 more minute. I think we can get through this. Chapter 50, Jacob dies. Look at verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us. He has only been being nice to us because Dad is alive. Dad's dead now. He's going to kill us and get us back. Verse 16, so they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Now remember, Dad said, don't kill us. That's what I kind of envision. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God your father. Joseph wept when they said that to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Vengeance is not mine, it's God's. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. This is just an amazing attitude and an amazing message. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God sent me ahead of you guys to prepare this place for you so that the nation could grow and be blessed and prosper and survive. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. All right, last two lessons. These come from later in the Bible, and we'll be done. God will work it out. In Psalm 105, 16 and 17, it says, when he summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. When you turn the next page from Genesis, Exodus 1, 8 and 10 says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. You know what this tells me is the generations just roll on and on and on. Joseph dies, and immediately there arises a Pharaoh that doesn't know him or his people. Joseph's dead and gone, but the story continues. Nobody in the Bible is really the hero of the story other than God and other than Jesus. And even us, all the good that we do, someday we will be replaced and someone else will take our place. But that's okay because we're not the main point of the story anyway. God is. And so it is, Joseph's so important, now he's gone and God's plan continues. And the last thing that I'll share is this: God promises that He'll work everything out for good. That doesn't mean everything in your life is good. Some of our lives are bad a lot of the time. Some of our lives are bad occasionally, and we deal with problems. But God promises it's okay. I will work it out eventually. And if we're faithful to God, that may not mean in this lifetime. We may die brokenhearted. But we have a heaven and an eternity to look forward to where God promises He'll make it right. Everything will be worth it one day if we'll stay with God. All right, thank you very much.